In the early days of the internet, millions of people logged on believing they had discovered a place where distance no longer mattered. Behind anonymous usernames, strangers became friends, communities formed overnight, and conversations unfolded beyond the view of the outside world. For investigators, it was an entirely new frontier. Most online interactions were harmless. Some led to lifelong friendships. Others became business partnerships or creative collaborations. But hidden among the countless message boards and chat rooms were isolated corners of the internet, where unusual fantasies and private interests could be discussed with almost complete anonymity. In 2001, authorities in Germany uncovered a case unlike anything they had encountered before. It was not simply because of the crime itself. It was because nearly every step leading to it had been documented electronically, through emails, online forums, digital messages, and computer files that investigators would later painstakingly reconstruct. The legal questions that followed would challenge courts, psychologists, and criminal investigators around the world. How should the law respond when consent is claimed in circumstances unlike any seen before? What responsibility do online communities bear when dangerous ideas move from fantasy into reality? And how did one investigation become one of the first major demonstrations of digital forensics in the internet age? Tonight, Criminalist Files examines one of Germany's most unusual criminal investigations, not to sensationalize the offender, but to understand how technology, criminal law, and modern investigative methods collided in a case that continues to be studied more than 2 decades later. Armin Meiwes, born December 1, 1961, in Essen, Germany, is a German criminal serving a life sentence for murder and disturbing the peace of the dead. He became internationally known as the Cannibal of Rothenburg because he consumed parts of his victim's body. Meiwes' father, his mother's third husband, left the family when Meiwes was 8 years old. After his 2 older half-brothers moved to Berlin, he was raised alone by his mother in the Essen district of Holsterhausen. According to his own statements, he developed cannibalistic fantasies at around the age of 12, which he later said were influenced in part by a film adaptation of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. A psychiatrist who evaluated him after his arrest concluded that he had suffered from long-standing feelings of inferiority and an attachment disorder dating back to childhood. After completing secondary school and leaving a commercial apprenticeship before graduation, Meiwes enlisted in the German Armed Forces in 1981 for a 12-year term. He spent most of his military career stationed in Rothenburg an der Fulda, where he lived with his mother in the nearby community of Rothenburg-Wüstefeld. During his service, he completed training as a non-commissioned officer and administrative specialist, ultimately leaving the military with the rank of sergeant major. He later worked as a computer technician for a bank data center in Kassel. Following the death of his mother in 1999, Meiwes used internet forums and personal advertisements to seek individuals interested in participating in cannibalistic fantasies. In February 2001, he met Bernd Jürgen Brandes, a 43-year-old engineer who had previously held a senior position at Siemens AG in Berlin. According to witness testimony presented during the investigation, Brandes had previously expressed fantasies involving severe bodily harm. On March 9, 2001, the two met at Kassel railway station and traveled to Meiwes' home in Rothenburg-Wüstefeld. Throughout the investigation and subsequent trials, Meiwes consistently maintained that Brandes had voluntarily consented to the events that followed, including his own death. After Brandes died, Meiwes dismembered the body, preserved portions of it, and recorded much of the incident on video. Psychiatrists who later evaluated Meiwes suggested that he believed consuming his victim would allow him to psychologically merge with or assume the identity of another person. The case remained undiscovered for more than a year. In 2002, Meiwes continued posting messages on internet forums seeking another willing participant. An Austrian university student in Innsbruck found one of the advertisements and alerted German authorities. Police traced the online postings to Meiwes and launched an investigation. Following a search of his home, Meiwes surrendered to his attorney on December 10, 2002, and made a full confession. Investigators recovered extensive physical and digital evidence, including video recordings that became central to the forensic investigation. He was placed in pre-trial detention at Kassel-Wilheiden prison. In December 2003, Meiwes stood trial before the Kassel Regional Court. He admitted responsibility for Brandes' death, but denied acting for sexual gratification. His defense argued that his actions were driven by an obsessive desire for human flesh and sought a conviction for manslaughter at the victim's request. Prosecutors maintained that the victim suffered from severe self-destructive tendencies and requested a conviction for murder, although they did not seek a finding of particular gravity of guilt. On January 30, 2004, the Kassel Regional Court convicted Meiwes of manslaughter and sentenced him to 8.5 years in prison. The court found him criminally responsible, but concluded that the victim had been incapable of giving legally valid consent to his own death. A 4.5-hour video recorded by Meiwes served as one of the principal pieces of forensic evidence during the proceedings. The forensic investigation was led by physician Manfred Reis, who later published a detailed account of the case in 2007. By the late 1990s, Germany had embraced a technological transformation that was reshaping everyday life across Europe. Personal computers were becoming increasingly common in homes, universities, and workplaces. Internet cafes appeared in city centers. Families purchased their first dial-up internet connections, accepting the familiar sound of a modem negotiating its connection as the gateway to a new world of information. For many users, the internet represented freedom. People who had once relied on libraries, newspapers, or long-distance telephone calls could suddenly communicate with strangers across continents in a matter of seconds. The internet also provided something that had rarely existed before on such a scale: anonymity. Unlike face-to-face conversations, online discussions often occurred behind screen names rather than real identities. Users could participate in niche communities dedicated to almost any hobby, profession, or interest without revealing much about themselves. Most of these communities were entirely harmless. Photography enthusiasts exchanged techniques. Historians debated obscure events. Programmers collaborated on software. Collectors searched for rare books and artifacts. But investigators would later discover that the same technology enabling positive communities could also connect individuals with highly unusual interests who might never have encountered one another in everyday life. The rapid growth of the internet had outpaced the development of investigative methods. Digital evidence was still a relatively new field. Police departments were accustomed to examining fingerprints, physical documents, and eyewitness testimony. Hard drives, deleted files, email archives, and online identities presented entirely different challenges. How could investigators prove who had written a message? How could electronic conversations be preserved as evidence? Could deleted files be recovered? These questions would become increasingly important as computer crime expanded during the late 1990s and early 2000s. At the same time, German law was adapting to technological changes that lawmakers could scarcely have imagined only a decade earlier. Courts had extensive experience interpreting physical evidence, but digital communications raised difficult questions about authentication, privacy, and intent. Forensic computer specialists were beginning to emerge as a new kind of investigator, professionals whose expertise combined traditional detective work with rapidly evolving computer science. Their work would soon become essential. When investigators eventually examined the digital trail connected to the Meiwes case, they discovered something unprecedented. Instead of relying primarily on eyewitnesses, they were able to reconstruct significant portions of the timeline through electronic records, emails, online messages, stored files, timestamps, and computer data that had quietly recorded interactions long before anyone realized their significance. The investigation demonstrated a turning point in criminal justice. Computers were no longer simply tools used by investigators. They had become crime scenes in their own right. Every login, every saved file, every timestamp, and every recovered document added another piece to the timeline. For today's investigators, that may seem routine. In the early 2000s, it represented one of the emerging frontiers of forensic science. As authorities began assembling that digital puzzle, they realized they were confronting not only an unusual criminal investigation, but also profound legal and ethical questions, unlike those posed by more conventional cases. The evidence would be extensive, the public reaction would be immediate, and the legal debate would continue long after the trial concluded. Instead of relying solely on memories that might fade or contradict one another, detectives increasingly relied upon electronic records capable of reconstructing events with remarkable precision. The Meiwes investigation became one of Germany's most closely studied examples of how digital evidence could transform a criminal investigation. At the same time, investigators recognized another important challenge. The Internet allowed individuals separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles to communicate privately without ever meeting in person. Traditional policing depended heavily upon geography. Neighborhood officers knew their communities. Local detectives worked within specific jurisdictions. Criminal activity usually left physical traces tied to a particular location. Online communication ignored those boundaries. Messages crossed national borders in seconds. Servers stored information in different countries. Electronic records required specialized warrants and technical expertise to recover. Investigators were entering unfamiliar territory. Looking back more than 2 decades later, many experts describe this period as a turning point. The investigation demonstrated that computers had become repositories of evidence every bit as important as fingerprints, handwritten letters, or physical documents. The lessons learned during those early digital investigations would eventually influence countless future cases involving fraud, cybercrime, organized crime, and homicide investigations. Today, digital forensic laboratories exist throughout the world. Investigators routinely recover deleted files, analyze mobile phones, reconstruct internet activity, and authenticate electronic communications. In the early years of widespread internet adoption, however, these techniques were still developing. Each case expanded the knowledge available to future investigators. The Meiwes investigation became part of that evolution. As detectives continued examining electronic records, they realized they possessed something unprecedented, a digital trail that would allow them to reconstruct events with extraordinary detail. But assembling that timeline would require patience, technical expertise, and careful attention to every piece of electronic evidence. The investigation was only beginning. The most difficult questions still lay ahead. To many people who knew him, Armin Meiwes appeared to live a remarkably ordinary life. He lived in the quiet town of Rothenburg an der Fulda in central Germany, an area better known for its historic architecture, rolling countryside, and peaceful neighborhoods than for becoming the focus of international headlines. Neighbors described the community as calm and predictable. Streets were lined with well-kept homes, local businesses served generations of families, and life generally moved at a slower pace than in Germany's larger cities. Nothing about the setting suggested it would one day become associated with one of the country's most unusual criminal investigations. Like many cases examined throughout criminal history, investigators would later discover an important lesson. Extraordinary crimes are often hidden behind ordinary appearances. Unlike the fictional portrayals common in movies and television, serious offenders frequently do not appear obviously dangerous. They work regular jobs, maintain routines, interact politely with neighbors, and often avoid drawing attention to themselves. This reality presents one of the greatest challenges for investigators. The people around them may never suspect that anything is wrong. Historical records indicate that Meiwes spent much of his adult life living in the family home where he had grown up. Psychologists who later evaluated him noted a childhood marked by social isolation and an unusually close relationship with his mother. Following her death, in the late 1990s, investigators and mental health professionals examined whether increased isolation had contributed to changes in his daily life. It is important to be careful when discussing these details. Many individuals experience loneliness, difficult childhoods, or the loss of loved ones without ever committing crimes. Researchers do not view these experiences as causes of criminal behavior. Instead, they are examined because they may provide context when trying to understand an individual's development. The distinction matters. Explaining background is not the same as explaining away responsibility. As the internet expanded during the late 1990s, millions of people discovered online communities that allowed them to connect with strangers who shared uncommon interests. Before the internet, someone with an unusual hobby might never meet another person with the same fascination. Online forums changed that almost overnight. Collectors found collectors. Historians found historians. Artists collaborated across continents. People struggling with rare illnesses discovered support groups that had never existed before. The internet became one of the greatest communication revolutions in modern history. Yet every technology carries both opportunity and risk. The same anonymity that encouraged creativity also allowed people to conceal their identities. Usernames replaced real names. Geographic distance disappeared. Conversations that once would have remained private now unfolded in digital spaces that investigators had little experience monitoring. At the time, internet culture was built largely on trust. Identity verification was rare. Many users assumed the person behind a screen name was exactly who they claimed to be. Law enforcement agencies were only beginning to understand how digital communities functioned. Investigators later learned that Meiwes participated in online forums dedicated to highly unusual fantasies. It is important to distinguish between fantasy expressed online and criminal conduct. The overwhelming majority of people who discuss fictional or unconventional fantasies never commit crimes. However, investigators later concluded that this case crossed an important boundary when online communication evolved into real-world planning. That transition became one of the central questions examined during the investigation. Where should society draw the line between protected expression and criminal preparation? Even today, That question continues to challenge courts and investigators around the world. Computer forensic specialists assigned to the case approached the evidence methodically. Rather than beginning with assumptions, they reconstructed digital activity piece by piece. Every recovered email, every archived message, every computer log, every timestamp. Together, these records began forming a detailed chronology. Unlike traditional witness testimony, digital evidence often leaves behind objective markers. A file may reveal when it was created. An email records the time it was sent. A computer operating system silently stores information that users often never realize exists. To investigators in the early 2000s, this represented an entirely new source of evidence. By the time German investigators began assembling the evidence, they understood they were dealing with an investigation unlike most homicide cases they had encountered. There were no eyewitnesses who could describe every stage of what had happened. There was no single moment that immediately revealed the complete picture. Instead, investigators faced hundreds of individual pieces of information scattered across computers, digital storage devices, handwritten notes, and physical evidence. Their task was not simply to identify what had occurred. Their task was to establish, beyond reasonable doubt, a complete and accurate timeline supported by verifiable evidence. Every investigation begins with questions. What happened? When did it happen? Who was involved? Can every conclusion be supported by reliable evidence? Those questions guided every decision investigators made throughout the case. Unlike many criminal investigations of the era, digital evidence occupied a central role from the very beginning. Personal computers had quietly become repositories of information that many users never considered. Operating systems automatically recorded timestamps. Email programs stored correspondence. Internet browsers maintained histories. Hard drives retained deleted information that often remained recoverable long after users believed it had disappeared. To experienced forensic examiners, computers had become silent witnesses. Rather than relying solely upon memory or testimony, investigators could compare electronic records against physical evidence, searching for consistency across multiple independent sources. Every confirmed detail strengthened the reliability of the overall timeline. Computer forensic specialists approached the evidence carefully. Before examining any digital media, investigators followed strict procedures designed to preserve the integrity of the information. Storage devices were documented and photographed. Evidence logs recorded every transfer. Forensic copies were created so the original media remained untouched during examination. Maintaining this chain of custody was essential. Any mistake could create uncertainty during future court proceedings. The objective was never simply to discover information. The objective was to ensure that every discovery could withstand careful scrutiny in court. As forensic analysts examined recovered files, investigators gradually assembled a chronological sequence of electronic activity. Individual records might appear insignificant on their own. An email timestamp, a saved document, a computer login, a deleted file recovered through forensic software. But together, these fragments formed a remarkably detailed timeline. Modern investigations frequently rely upon this same principle. Rarely does one piece of evidence solve a case. Instead, investigators compare numerous independent sources until a consistent picture begins to emerge. Every verified fact supports another. Eventually, patterns become difficult to ignore. While digital specialists analyzed computers, traditional detectives continued interviewing witnesses and documenting physical evidence. This collaboration demonstrated an important lesson in modern criminal investigation. Technology never replaces investigators. Instead, technology expands the range of information available to them. Experienced detectives interpret evidence. Forensic scientists analyze it. Laboratories verify it. Prosecutors organize it. Together, each discipline contributes to the final understanding of a case. The Meiwes investigation became an early example of this multidisciplinary approach. As investigators continued their work, they also recognized that the Internet itself had become part of the investigation. Online communication was no longer simply a means of exchanging messages. It had become a location where evidence existed. Forums, electronic correspondence, archived files, and computer records all became relevant to understanding the sequence of events. This represented a significant shift in investigative thinking. For decades, detectives searched homes, offices, and vehicles. Now they also searched hard drives. They analyzed digital storage. They reconstructed online communication. The crime scene had expanded beyond the physical world. The investigation also highlighted the importance of patience. Public attention often focuses on dramatic arrests or courtroom testimony, but much of criminal investigation consists of careful, methodical work carried out far from television cameras. Hours become days. Days become weeks. Investigators compare reports. Laboratories conduct examinations. Specialists verify findings independently. Every conclusion must be supported by evidence rather than assumption. That deliberate process protects both the integrity of the investigation and the fairness of the judicial system. As the evidence accumulated, investigators became increasingly confident that they could reconstruct a comprehensive timeline supported by multiple independent sources. Each verified detail reinforced the next. Digital records aligned with physical evidence. Witness interviews supported documented timelines. Forensic analysis confirmed the sequence investigators had been building piece by piece. This careful reconstruction would ultimately become one of the defining features of the case. Rather than depending upon a single confession or one decisive discovery, the investigation demonstrated how modern forensic science could combine traditional detective work with digital evidence to establish a clear chronology. It also illustrated how rapidly criminal investigation was evolving in the early years of widespread Internet use. Looking back today, investigators often cite this period as an important milestone in digital forensic history. Many procedures now considered routine were still developing. Techniques for preserving electronic evidence, methods for recovering deleted files, standards for documenting digital media, protocols for authenticating electronic communications. Each investigation contributed valuable experience. Each courtroom tested new legal questions. Each forensic examination improved future investigative practice. The lessons learned extended well beyond this single case. They influenced how investigators approached cybercrime, financial fraud, online exploitation, organized crime, and countless other investigations in the decades that followed. As detectives finalized their reconstruction of the evidence, the investigation entered a new phase. The focus shifted from discovering what had happened to determining how the evidence would be presented before a court of law. That transition would introduce an entirely different challenge. The facts were becoming clearer. The legal questions were only beginning. By the time the court proceedings began, the case had attracted widespread attention across Germany and beyond. Newspapers, television broadcasters, and legal scholars all recognized that the investigation presented questions extending well beyond the facts of a single criminal case. For many members of the public, the Internet had been viewed primarily as a tool for communication, education, and commerce. The investigation prompted renewed discussion about the responsibilities of online platforms, the challenges of anonymous communication, and the extent to which digital interactions could influence real-world events. Legal experts were equally interested in the case because it tested principles that courts rarely confront. Judges are often asked to determine what happened and whether the available evidence proves a criminal offense. In this instance, the proceedings also required careful examination of intent, consent, criminal responsibility, and the limits imposed by German law. Throughout the trial, prosecutors relied on a combination of physical evidence, digital records, expert testimony, and forensic documentation. The strength of the prosecution did not rest on a single dramatic discovery. Instead, it reflected the cumulative effect of numerous independent pieces of evidence that, taken together, established a consistent and well-supported chronology. This approach illustrates an important feature of modern criminal investigations. Complex cases are rarely solved through one decisive clue. They are built gradually through corroboration, documentation, and careful verification. Each piece of evidence must withstand scrutiny on its own, while also fitting within the broader investigative timeline. The proceedings also highlighted the growing importance of expert witnesses. Specialists in forensic science, psychology, pathology, and digital evidence explained technical findings in language that judges and juries could understand. Their role was not to determine guilt or innocence, but to provide scientific context that assisted the court in evaluating the evidence. Public discussion frequently centered on the relationship between technology and criminal investigations. During the early 2000s, digital forensics was still developing as a specialized discipline. The case demonstrated that computers, storage devices, and electronic communications could preserve valuable evidence, sometimes documenting events with a level of detail unavailable through traditional investigative methods alone. Universities and police academies later examined the investigation as an example of how digital evidence should be collected, preserved, and presented. Emphasis was placed on maintaining chain of custody, creating forensic copies of storage media, documenting every analytical step, and ensuring that electronic evidence could be independently verified. The case also reinforced the importance of multidisciplinary investigations. Detectives, forensic scientists, digital analysts, prosecutors, and legal experts each contributed different forms of expertise. No single investigator possessed every answer. Success depended upon cooperation among specialists working toward a common objective. Another lesson involved public communication. High-profile investigations inevitably generate speculation, rumors, and misinformation. Law enforcement agencies must balance transparency with the need to protect the integrity of an ongoing investigation. Releasing incomplete or inaccurate information can influence witnesses, complicate court proceedings, or undermine public confidence. Media organizations likewise faced important editorial decisions. Responsible reporting required distinguishing verified facts from speculation and avoiding unnecessary sensationalism. Many journalists later reflected on how difficult it can be to report accurately on extraordinary cases while respecting victims, families, and legal processes. Beyond the courtroom, the investigation influenced conversations about internet safety and digital literacy. As online communities expanded, Educators and policymakers increasingly emphasized that actions taken online can have real-world consequences. Anonymous communication does not eliminate legal responsibility, and digital activity often leaves recoverable records that investigators may later examine. Today, digital evidence plays a central role in countless investigations involving fraud, financial crime, cybercrime, organized crime, missing persons, and homicide. Techniques that were still evolving in the early 2000s are now standard practice in forensic laboratories around the world. Looking back, many investigators view this case as part of a broader transition in criminal justice. It marked a period when computers ceased to be viewed simply as tools used during investigations and became sources of evidence requiring specialized examination. That evolution continues today as investigators confront encrypted devices, cloud storage, artificial intelligence, and increasingly sophisticated digital technologies. Ultimately, the enduring significance of the investigation lies not in the notoriety of the offender, but in the lessons it provided. The case demonstrated the value of scientific rigor, interdisciplinary cooperation, careful documentation, and respect for due process. Those principles remain essential to effective criminal investigations, regardless of the technology involved or the complexity of the case. As the proceedings concluded, attention gradually shifted from the courtroom to the broader impact the investigation would have on forensic science, legal education, and future criminal investigations. Those lasting changes form the final chapter of this documentary. Every major criminal investigation leaves behind two separate histories. The first is recorded in court documents, forensic reports, and investigative files. It tells the story of what investigators discovered, how evidence was collected, and how the legal system ultimately reached its conclusions. The second history is often less visible. It is written in the procedures that change afterward. It appears in revised investigative manuals, updated training programs, improved forensic laboratories, and new generations of investigators who study earlier cases to avoid repeating past mistakes. The Meiwes investigation belongs to that second history. Today, it is remembered not only because of the unusual legal questions it presented, but because it arrived during a period when criminal investigations throughout Germany were rapidly adapting to the digital age. In the early years of widespread internet use, investigators faced challenges unlike those encountered by previous generations. For decades, detectives had relied primarily upon physical evidence, fingerprints, handwritten documents, photographs, witness interviews, and crime scene examinations. Computers gradually changed that reality. Hard drives became repositories of information. Email replaced handwritten correspondence. Digital photographs replaced film. Electronic calendars documented schedules automatically. Even routine computer activity generated records that investigators could later examine. Law enforcement agencies recognized that the methods used to recover and preserve digital evidence required the same scientific discipline long associated with traditional forensic science. Evidence could not simply be viewed. It had to be preserved, authenticated, documented, verified. Those principles became increasingly standardized across German forensic laboratories. One of the lasting lessons reinforced by investigations of this era was the importance of maintaining an unbroken chain of custody. Every item of evidence, whether physical or digital, required careful documentation from the moment it entered police custody until its presentation in court. Investigators recorded who collected the evidence, who transported it, who examined it, where it was stored, when it was accessed. These procedures protect both the investigation and the rights of every individual involved. Reliable evidence is not simply evidence that exists. It is evidence whose integrity can be demonstrated from beginning to end. As digital investigations became more common, specialized forensic units expanded throughout Germany. Computer scientists, forensic analysts, and experienced detectives increasingly worked side by side. Each discipline contributed different expertise. Traditional investigators understood interviews, timelines, and physical evidence. Digital specialists understood file systems, deleted data, operating systems, and electronic communications. Laboratory scientists verified technical findings using repeatable scientific methods. Together, they formed multidisciplinary investigative teams, capable of addressing increasingly complex criminal investigations. This collaborative model has since become standard practice throughout much of Europe. The investigation also encouraged broader legal discussion within German universities and legal scholarship. Law professors examined questions surrounding digital evidence, electronic communications, and evidentiary standards. Judges and prosecutors considered how emerging technologies fit within long-established legal principles. Although technology changes rapidly, the core principles of criminal justice remain remarkably consistent. Evidence must be reliable. Investigations must be fair. Every conclusion must be supported by facts that can withstand independent scrutiny. Those principles continue to guide German courts today. Another significant development involved professional education. Police academies gradually expanded instruction in digital investigations. Future investigators learned not only how to process traditional crime scenes, but also how to secure computers, preserve electronic storage devices, recover digital records, and document electronic evidence according to accepted forensic standards. Students trained in simulated investigative environments where every action, from collecting evidence to documenting laboratory procedures, was evaluated for accuracy and professionalism. These educational programs reflected an important reality. Technology evolves continuously. Investigative training must evolve with it. Historical cases also remind investigators that public confidence depends upon transparency and professionalism. Communities expect investigators to conduct impartial inquiries guided by evidence rather than assumption. Every documented procedure exists for a reason. Evidence is photographed before collection. Laboratory examinations follow standardized protocols. Independent experts review findings. Court proceedings provide opportunities for both prosecution and defense to examine the evidence presented. These safeguards help ensure that justice depends upon verifiable facts rather than speculation. Looking across Germany today, modern forensic laboratories bear little resemblance to those of the early 2000s. High-capacity evidence servers securely preserve digital information. Advanced imaging systems create exact forensic copies of electronic media. Specialized software assists investigators in organizing enormous volumes of digital evidence. Three-dimensional documentation records physical crime scenes with extraordinary precision. Yet despite these technological advances, the most important investigative tools remain unchanged. Patience, critical thinking, scientific discipline, attention to detail. Technology assists investigators. It does not replace professional judgment. The influence of investigations such as this extends beyond Germany. International law enforcement agencies routinely exchange forensic knowledge, investigative techniques, and scientific research. digital crime rarely respects national borders. Electronic communications may cross several countries in seconds. Successful investigations increasingly depend upon cooperation between forensic laboratories, prosecutors, judicial authorities, and international policing organizations. The lessons learned from earlier investigations continue to strengthen those partnerships. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is that every major investigation contributes to future knowledge. A solved case does more than resolve a single criminal proceeding. It improves investigative methods. It strengthens forensic science. It refines legal procedures. It influences education. It prepares future investigators to face challenges that previous generations could scarcely imagine. That continuous process of learning defines modern criminal investigation. Cases are studied not to celebrate those responsible for crimes, but to improve the pursuit of justice. As we conclude this episode, it is worth remembering that history is shaped not only by the crimes that occur, but also by the professionals who dedicate themselves to uncovering the truth. Behind every investigation are detectives who followed evidence wherever it led, forensic scientists who verified each finding with precision, prosecutors who presented carefully documented facts before the court, judges who applied the law impartially, and educators who transformed difficult lessons into better training for future investigators. Their work continues long after headlines fade. It continues in forensic laboratories, in police academies, in court archives, in research institutions, and in every investigation that benefits from the knowledge gained through those that came before. This is the lasting legacy, not the notoriety of a single individual, but the continuing evolution of science, law, and professional investigation in the service of justice. On April 22, 2005, Germany's Federal Court of Justice overturned the original verdict and ordered a retrial before the Frankfurt am Main Regional Court. The court ruled that the lower court had not properly evaluated whether the legal elements required for a murder conviction had been satisfied, requiring the case to be reconsidered. The retrial began on January 12, 2006, before the 21st Criminal Chamber of the Frankfurt Assize Court. On May 9, 2006, Meiwes was convicted of murder and disturbing the peace of the dead, with the latter offense relating to his treatment of the victim's remains. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The Federal Court of Justice upheld the conviction in February 2007, and on October 7, 2008, the Federal Constitutional Court declined to hear Meiwes' constitutional complaint, leaving the life sentence in place. Imprisonment. Meiwes is serving his sentence at Kassel II Prison, a correctional facility with a social therapeutic program. While incarcerated, he joined the prison's Green Prison Group, a discussion and self-help organization whose views are broadly aligned with Germany's Green Party. His participation generated political debate in Hesse in 2007, although Green Party state legislator Andreas Jürgens clarified that membership in the prison group did not make Meiwes a member of the political party itself. Later developments. In a newspaper interview published in July 2013, Meiwes described his actions as wrong and completely abnormal. He first became eligible to seek parole in December 2017. Later that year, he applied for early release, but the Kassel Regional Court denied the request. He appealed the decision, but on September 27, 2018, the Frankfurt Higher Regional Court upheld the lower court's ruling, stating that a favorable rehabilitation prognosis could not yet be made. The decision was final and could not be appealed. In August 2020, another request for early release was rejected for the same reason. In 2025, Meiwes' new defense attorney submitted another application seeking his early release.